Story number 1. The Ghost Train of Hokkaido. They call it Shinda Rezsha, the Train of the Dead. Growing up in a small town in Hokkaido, I always thought the story was just that. A story. A local legend meant to scare children into staying home on cold winter nights. My grandfather, however, treated the tale with an unnerving seriousness. Every Christmas Eve, as the snow fell and the winds howled through the pine forests, he would sit by the window with a single candle burning, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "You must never board it," he told me when I was a boy, his voice low and rough like gravel. "If you see the train, you must look away. Do not meet the eyes of its passengers. And above all, do not step aboard. Once you do, you will never come back." I laughed it off. Of course, ghost trains, wandering souls, these were the stories of old men clinging to the past. But that was before the winter of 1997, when I saw the train for myself. It was a night much like this one, the air sharp with frost and the snow piling high against the windows of our little house. I was 17, restless and eager to escape the suffocating quiet of village life. My friends had gathered at the abandoned railway station, a place we often used as a makeshift clubhouse. It was the perfect spot for telling ghost stories, drinking stolen sake, and laughing at the superstitions of our elders. That night, the story of the ghost train came up, as it always did in late December. My friend Kenta, the loudest and most brash among us, slapped the table and declared he wasn't afraid of any old legend. "Let's wait for it," he said, grinning. "If it's real, we'll see it tonight." The rest of us laughed nervously but agreed. It wasn't like we had anything better to do, so we waited, huddled in the cold, our breath fogging in the frigid air. Hours passed, and the wind howled louder, shaking the rusted remnants of the station. One by one, my friends began to lose interest, muttering excuses about the late hour and the biting cold. By midnight, it was just Kenta and me left on the platform. That's when we heard it. The sound was faint at first, a low, mournful whistle that seemed to rise out of the wind itself. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine, but I told myself it was just the cold. Kenta grinned, his breath clouding in the air. "Hear that?" he said, his voice tight with excitement. "It's coming." The whistle grew louder, joined by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks. A light appeared in the distance, faint and flickering, like a lantern swaying in the dark. As it approached, I realized it wasn't just a light. It was the headlamp of a train. The engine was ancient, its iron frame covered in frost and ice. The carriages that followed were dark and weathered, their windows opaque with frost. The train seemed to glide silently over the snow-covered tracks, its whistle a haunting wail that echoed through the empty station. I should have run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn away, to flee back into the warmth and safety of home. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot. My eyes locked on the train as it slowed to a stop before us. The doors slid open with a hiss, releasing a blast of icy air that smelled of decay and something older, something wrong. Inside, the carriages were dimly lit, their seats occupied by shadowy figures. They didn't move, didn't speak. They simply sat there staring straight ahead with blank, empty eyes. Kenta laughed, though it sounded forced. "Well, are we getting on or what?" Before I could stop him, he stepped forward. The platform seemed to groan beneath his weight, as if protesting his decision. He turned back to me, his face pale but defiant. "Come on," he said. "Don't be such a coward." I shook my head, my throat dry. "Don't do it, Kenta, please." He rolled his eyes and stepped onto the train. For a moment, I thought he would come back. He stood in the doorway, looking at me, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Then the doors slid shut, and the train began to move. I ran alongside it, shouting his name, but the train picked up speed, its wheels clattering louder and louder. The whistle screamed, drowning out my voice. Through the frosted window, I saw Kenta's face, pressed against the glass, His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His eyes were wide, pleading, and then he was gone. The train disappeared into the night, its headlamp a fading glow swallowed by the snow. The tracks behind it were untouched, as if it had never been there at all. I stumbled home, numb with cold and terror. My grandfather was waiting for me, his face grave. "You saw it," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to speak. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. "The train takes those who are lost, those who wander too close to its path. You were lucky to resist. Many don't." I wanted to tell him about Kenta, to beg him for answers, but the words wouldn't come. I spent the rest of that night by the fire, staring into the flames and trying to forget the empty eyes of the passengers. Kenta was never seen again. His disappearance was chalked up to a tragic accident, perhaps a fall into the icy river that ran near the station. But I knew the truth. He was still out there, somewhere, riding the ghost train through an endless winter night. I left the village not long after, unable to bear the memories that lingered in every corner. But even now, years later, I can't escape the sound of that whistle. On cold December nights, when the snow falls thick and the wind howls through the trees, I hear it calling to me, a mournful wail that chills my blood. They say the train only comes for those who are lost, those who have no place left to go. I pray that I never see it again, but deep down, I know it's only a matter of time, because the train never forgets, and it always comes back. Story number 2. The empty train. I first heard about the train when I was a boy, huddled by the fire in my grandmother's small house in Bavaria. She called it Der Geisterzug, the ghost train, and spoke of it in hushed tones, as if even mentioning its name might summon it from the depths of the past. "They say it still rides the rails on cold winter nights," she whispered, her voice trembling. "A train with no passengers, no crew, just the echoes of those it took." At the time, I dismissed her story as an old woman's superstition. But years later, when I joined the railway company as a maintenance worker, the legend resurfaced in ways I could no longer ignore. It was December of 1943, and the war had turned winter into a season of despair. The snow came early that year, blanketing the countryside in a silence so profound it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. The war raged on in the distance, but here, in the quiet isolation of southern Germany, the railway was our lifeline. I had been assigned to the rescue crew stationed at a small depot near the Black Forest. Our job was simple: keep the trains running, no matter the weather. The work was hard, the hours long, but it kept me away from the front lines. And for that, I was grateful. On the night of December 22nd, the call came in. A passenger train bound for Munich had failed to arrive at its destination. Last radio contact placed it somewhere near the forested stretch between Karlsruhe and Freiburg. The train was carrying evacuees, women, children, and elderly fleeing the bombing of the northern cities. When the dispatcher described the situation, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The ghost train. I shook the thought from my head and joined the rescue crew. We boarded a small locomotive equipped for snow clearing and set off down the line, the icy wind cutting through the cab like a knife. The first few miles were uneventful, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels almost lulling me to sleep. But as we approached the stretch of track near the forest, the atmosphere changed. The snow grew heavier, falling in thick, wet flakes that clung to the windows and obscured our view. The headlamp pierced the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Slow it down," called Franz, the conductor, his voice tight with unease. "We're getting close." The train ahead had been scheduled to stop at a small station near the edge of the forest. When we arrived, the platform was deserted, the snow untouched except for the faint impressions of animal tracks. We found no sign of the missing train. "Maybe they stopped further up the line," suggested one of the men, but his voice lacked conviction. We pressed on, the air inside the cab growing colder with each passing mile. Then, just beyond a bend in the track, we saw it, the missing train. It sat motionless in the snow, its carriages dark and silent. The engine was still running, its faint hum barely audible over the howling wind. But there was no movement, no sign of life. We brought our locomotive to a halt and stepped out into the cold, our boots crunching on the frozen ground. The closer we got, the worse the silence became. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a suffocating stillness, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. I climbed into the first carriage, flashlight in hand, and called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No answer. The carriage was empty. The seats were still warm, and the air carried the faint scent of perfume and sweat. Luggage sat neatly in the racks, untouched, as if the passengers had simply vanished. I moved to the next car, then the next. But it was the same story. No bodies, no blood, no sign of struggle, just rows of empty seats and abandoned belongings. When I reached the rear of the train, I found Franz standing by the open door. He was staring into the forest, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I strained my ears but heard nothing at first. Then it came, a faint, high-pitched sound, like children laughing. It was coming from the trees. We searched the surrounding area but found nothing. The tracks leading to and from the train were clear, with no sign that anyone had disembarked. And yet the laughter persisted, growing louder and more distorted, until it was impossible to tell whether it was joy or anguish. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The temperature inside the train plummeted, frost forming on the windows and walls. The engine, which had been running smoothly, sputtered and died without explanation. And the whispers started. At first, they were barely audible, a soft murmur at the edge of hearing. But as midnight approached, they grew louder, filling the carriages with a cacophony of voices. They spoke in a language I didn't recognize, their words sharp and guttural, like the crackle of ice breaking underfoot. Then the shadows came. They flickered at the edges of the train, dark shapes that moved too quickly to be human. Franz swore he saw a face pressed against one of the windows, its eyes burning with a pale, ghostly light. The rest of the crew tried to dismiss it as a trick of the mind. But I knew better. We were not alone. By dawn, the whispers had stopped, and the shadows were gone. We returned to our locomotive, leaving the train behind. The snow had buried its tracks, erasing any evidence of its journey. When we reported back to the depot, our supervisor listened in silence, his expression unreadable. Then he handed us each a sheet of paper and instructed us to write down what we had seen. I never found out what happened to those reports, but I suspect they were buried. Like so many other wartime secrets, the train was quietly removed from the schedule, its disappearance attributed to the chaos of the war. But those of us who were there that night knew the truth. I left the railway company soon after, but the memory of that night has stayed with me. Every winter, when the snow falls thick and the nights grow long, I hear the whispers in my dreams. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I think I can hear the faint laughter of children, carried on the icy breeze. The ghost train is still out there, waiting for its next passengers, and it always arrives on time. Story number 3. Train number 366. It was a bitterly cold Christmas Eve in 1947, and snow fell in thick, swirling flakes that seemed to muffle the world. I was young then, just 22, with my whole life ahead of me, or so I thought. The town where I grew up was one of those nameless dots on the map in northern Canada, a place where winters were long, summers were fleeting, and most dreams never made it past the endless horizon of snow and ice. I had boarded train number 366 that night with a heart full of hope. The train was a lifeline, connecting our isolated little town to the larger cities to the south. It was packed with holiday travelers, parents clutching children bundled in wool coats, young couples holding hands, and men with weary faces who smelled faintly of tobacco and whiskey. Everyone was eager to escape the cold and reach their destinations in time for Christmas morning. The train pulled out of the station at exactly 6 p.m., its whistle slicing through the frigid air like a blade. I found a seat near the back of the passenger car, close to the window, where I could watch the snow blur past. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks was soothing, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of peace. Little did I know that peace would be short-lived. The first hour of the journey passed uneventfully. The train rocked gently as it wound its way through the wilderness, the dark shapes of pine trees and snowdrifts flashing by in the dim light of the oil lamps. I had just started to doze off when the train lurched violently, jerking me awake. People gasped, and a few cried out as luggage tumbled from overhead racks. The train screeched to a halt, its whistle letting out a mournful wail that echoed into the night. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the soft hiss of steam and the muffled whispers of confused passengers. A man in a conductor's uniform hurried through the car, his expression grim. "Stay seated," he barked, though his voice betrayed a note of fear. "We've stopped to check the tracks. Everything's fine." But everything was not fine. Minutes stretched into an hour, and still, the train did not move. The cold began to seep into the cars, the oil lamps casting flickering shadows on the walls. People began to grow restless, shifting in their seats and murmuring among themselves. The conductor didn't return, and when one of the braver passengers went to look for him, they came back pale and trembling. "The engine car is empty," they said. "The crew is gone. Gone." The word settled over us like a shroud. The passengers erupted into a flurry of questions and panic. But no one had any answers. I joined a small group that ventured out into the snow to investigate. The wind howled around us, biting through our coats as we trudged toward the front of the train. The engine was still running, its boiler hissing softly in the freezing air. But the cabin was empty. The engineer and firemen were nowhere to be found. "What the hell?" someone muttered. Their breath hung in the air like a ghost. Then we heard it, a faint, high-pitched sound carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was the whistle, distorted by the storm, but as it grew louder, I realized it was something else entirely. It was the sound of children crying. We stumbled back to the passenger car, our nerves frayed and our faces raw from the cold. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. People huddled together in silence, their breath fogging the windows. The crying continued, faint but unmistakable, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then the shadows began to move. At first, it was subtle, a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shape that didn't belong. But soon, the figures became clearer. Dark silhouettes glided past the windows, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. One by one, the passengers noticed them, and a collective gasp filled the car. Someone screamed, a sharp, raw sound that made my blood run cold. "They're just shadows," an older man insisted, his voice shaking. "It's a trick of the light." But we all knew better. The figures moved with purpose, pausing occasionally to peer inside. I felt their gaze like a weight pressing against my chest. When I locked eyes with one of them, a wave of cold washed over me, more intense than anything I'd ever felt. It wasn't just physical. It was as if the very warmth of my soul was being leached away. Panic set in. People began shouting, banging on the walls, and trying to pry open the doors. But the doors wouldn't budge, and the windows refused to break no matter how hard we struck them. We were trapped. And then the whispers started. Soft and insidious, they slithered through the car like smoke. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, though the tone was unmistakable: hunger, despair, malice. The shadows outside grew bolder, pressing against the glass, their forms shifting and writhing like living smoke. The crying had stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. One by one, the passengers began to vanish. It happened quietly, almost imperceptibly. I glanced away for a moment, and when I looked back, Someone would be gone. Their belongings remained, untouched, as if they'd simply evaporated. I clutched the armrest of my seat, my knuckles white, and prayed to a god I wasn't sure existed. By dawn, I was the only one left. The train was silent, the windows frosted over with a thick layer of ice. The shadows were gone, and the air felt strangely still, as if the storm itself had been holding its breath and was finally exhaling. I stumbled to the door and found it open, the snow outside untouched by footprints. I stepped off the train, my legs trembling, and began to walk. I don't remember how far I went or how long it took, but eventually, I reached a small village. The locals took me in, their faces pale as I recounted what had happened. They said the train would return every Christmas Eve, stopping in the same spot, its whistle echoing through the mountains. Some claimed it was cursed, a vessel for lost souls. Others said it was a warning, though no one could tell me of what. I never boarded a train again. Even now, as an old man, the sound of a whistle sends a shiver down my spine. Every Christmas Eve, I light a candle and pray for the passengers of train number 366, hoping they've found peace. But deep down, I know they haven't. The train still runs, its wheels grinding against the tracks, carrying its ghostly cargo through the snow. And if you listen closely on a quiet winter night, you can hear the faint sound of children crying, calling out for a salvation that will never come, because some journeys have no end. Story number 4. The Ghost in the Clock. The Orient Express had always been a symbol of luxury, mystery, and the promise of adventure. In December of 1932, it was also my escape. I was a writer, well, trying to be one, and after several failed attempts to break into the London literary scene, I decided to try my luck elsewhere. Europe seemed like a good place to start, and the Orient Express, with its Art Deco interiors and storied history, was the perfect way to begin my new chapter. The train departed from Calais on a bitterly cold evening, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones and lingers there. Snow covered the platform, and my breath fogged the air as I boarded. The conductor greeted me with a polite nod and directed me to my compartment. It was small but elegant, with polished wood paneling, plush seating, and a bed that folded down from the wall. For a struggling writer, it felt almost too grand. The other passengers were a mix of the usual suspects: wealthy socialites, businessmen, and a smattering of travelers seeking the romance of the train. One man, however, stood out. He was older, dressed in a dark coat and scarf, with a face like a chiseled mask. His eyes, pale and piercing, seemed to notice everything. He sat alone in the dining car, his hands resting on a small velvet box. I wouldn't have thought much of him if it weren't for what happened later. It was after dinner, as I sat in my compartment with a notebook in hand, that there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, the man from the dining car was standing there, the velvet box in his hands. "I couldn't help but notice you seemed lost," he said, his voice smooth and low. "A traveler without a destination." I was taken aback. "I suppose you could say that," I replied cautiously. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes, and extended the box toward me. "A gift, to guide you." Inside was a pocket watch, a beautiful antique with intricate engravings on its silver case. The face was white enamel, its hands delicately wrought in black. I should have refused. I didn't know this man, and gifts from strangers on a train seemed like the beginning of a bad story. But there was something about the watch that drew me in, something almost hypnotic. "Thank you," I said, taking it reluctantly. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Take care of it. Keeps more than time." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me holding the strange gift. That night, the train cut through the snow-covered countryside, its rhythmic motion lulling me into a false sense of security. The watch sat on the small table by my bed, its soft ticking filling the room. Couldn't sleep, so I wrote in my notebook, jotting down fragments of ideas and bits of dialogue that would never amount to anything. Then the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint murmuring that ebbed and flowed. But as I listened closer, I realized it was a voice, low and indistinct. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I turned off the lamp and pressed my ear to the wall, thinking it might be another passenger. But the whispers didn't come from the walls, they came from the watch. I stared at it, heart pounding. As the voice grew louder, it spoke in a language I didn't recognize, its tone insistent and commanding. The hands of the watch began to move, spinning wildly, faster and faster until they were a blur. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The room was silent, the air heavy with something I couldn't name. I stuffed the watch back into its box and shoved it into my bag, determined to forget about it. The next morning, I woke to the sound of commotion. Stepping into the corridor, I found a cluster of passengers gathered outside one of the compartments. A man, a banker, I'd overheard the night before, had been found dead. His face was contorted in terror, his hands clutching his chest as if he'd been trying to rip his heart out. The conductor dismissed it as a heart attack, but whispers of foul play rippled through the train. I couldn't help but think of the watch and the strange man who'd given it to me. When I asked the conductor about him, he looked puzzled. "We have no record of such a passenger," he said. "Perhaps he disembarked during the night." But that was impossible. The train hadn't stopped. Over the next 2 days, the whispers grew worse. I heard them at all hours, not just in my compartment but in the dining car, the corridors, even the lavatory. They followed me, constant, haunting presence. The watch, no matter where I hid it, seemed to move on its own. I'd find it on the table, ticking softly, as if daring me to open it. On the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. I took the watch to the rear car, where the luggage was stored, and smashed it against the floor with all my strength. The case cracked, revealing the delicate mechanisms inside. But the whispers didn't stop. Instead, they turned into screams, piercing, inhuman wails that filled the car with an unbearable noise. Panicked, I threw the pieces out the window, watching as they disappeared into the snow. The screams faded, replaced by a chilling silence. When the train finally reached its destination, I was a wreck. I stepped onto the platform in Istanbul, the bright sunlight doing little to dispel the darkness that had settled over me. I didn't look back at the train, nor did I ever board the Orient Express again. A week later, I read about another passenger who had died under mysterious circumstances on the return journey. The article mentioned a velvet box found in his compartment, though its contents were never disclosed. The watch had returned. To this day, I don't know what it was or why it chose me. Perhaps it was cursed, a relic of some dark past. Or perhaps it was never meant to keep time at all but something far more sinister. All I know is that the Orient Express still runs. And somewhere, ticking softly in the shadows, the watch is waiting for its next owner. If you ever find yourself aboard that train and a stranger offers you a gift, refuse it, because some things are better left untouched. Their secrets buried in the snow. Story number 5. The Ghost Train of Sierra Hollow. The year was 1910, and the Sierra Hollow rail line was the pride of the West. It cut through towering mountains and vast valleys, its iron tracks threading through some of the most treacherous terrain America had to offer. As a young station hand at the time, I often marveled at how the trains, hulking beasts of steel and steam, managed to conquer nature's harshest challenges. But there were whispers, even then, stories about the Sierra Hollow stretch, rumors that the mountains had a way of taking what wasn't theirs to give back. On Christmas Eve of that year, a passenger train left the station in Carson City, Nevada, bound for Sacramento. It was a night of biting cold, the kind that turns your breath into daggers and freezes the very marrow in your bones. The train was packed with holiday travelers, families, businessmen, and young lovers eager to reunite with loved ones for Christmas. The engine groaned as it pulled out of the station, its whistle piercing the cold air like a mournful cry. I watched it go, never imagining it would be the last time anyone saw those passengers alive. The storm hit just before midnight. The mountains were no stranger to snowstorms, but this one was different. The wind howled like a banshee, hurling snow in every direction and obliterating the tracks. The temperature plummeted, and visibility dropped to near zero. Word came in that the train had been delayed by the weather, but no one was worried yet. Delays were common in the winter months. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape buried under feet of snow. The train was still missing. At first, the railway company assumed it had simply stopped at a way station to wait out the storm. But as the hours turned into days, concern grew. Search parties were dispatched, braving the treacherous conditions to find the train and its passengers. What they found, however, was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The train was discovered a week later, buried in a narrow ravine deep in the mountains. A massive avalanche had swallowed it whole, its force crumpling the carriages like tin cans and scattering debris across the snow. The scene was one of utter devastation, the kind that makes you question whether God is truly watching over the world. But that wasn't the worst part. The train was empty. There were no bodies, no signs of life anywhere. The seats were vacant, the luggage untouched, and the dining car still set with half-eaten meals. It was as if the passengers had simply vanished into thin air. Even more disturbing were the footprints, hundreds of them, leading away from the train and into the woods. They stopped abruptly at the tree line, as though the people who made them had been plucked from existence. The search continued for weeks, but no trace of the passengers or crew was ever found. Officially, the tragedy was blamed on the avalanche, though the lack of bodies was conveniently left out of the reports. Unofficially, the locals had their own theories. Some blamed the mountains themselves, claiming they were cursed, a place where the dead refused to stay buried. Others whispered about the ghost train, a phantom locomotive that appeared on snowy nights, its whistle echoing through the valleys like a mournful dirge. I tried to forget about it, to move on with my life. But the mountains have a way of holding on to you, and some memories refuse to fade. 10 years later, on Christmas Eve of 1920, I found myself working as the station master in a small mountain town near Sierra Hollow. The job was quiet, the kind of work that lets a man forget his troubles. Or so I thought. That night, as the snow fell softly outside, I was alone in the station, sipping coffee and reading the paper, when I heard it, a faint whistle in the distance. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the sound grew louder, unmistakable. It was the whistle of a steam engine, a sound I hadn't heard in years. I stepped outside, the cold biting at my face, and peered into the darkness. The snow was falling thick and fast, but through the white haze, I saw it, the train. Its headlights cut through the storm like ghostly eyes, and its carriages glowed faintly, as if lit from within by an otherworldly fire. It moved slowly, almost hesitantly, as if unsure of its place in the world. The sight of it filled me with a deep, primal fear, but also an inexplicable sense of longing. As it drew closer, I noticed the figures inside. They were passengers, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes hollow and unseeing. They stared straight ahead, oblivious to the world outside. I recognized some of them, the young couple who had boarded at Carson City, the businessman with the silver pocket watch, the little girl clutching her doll. They were exactly as I remembered them, frozen in time. The train slowed as it approached the platform, its wheels grinding against the snow-covered tracks. Came to a stop, its doors hissing open with an eerie finality. I stood frozen, unable to move, as the figures inside turned their heads toward me in unison. Their eyes met mine, and in that moment, I understood. They weren't passengers anymore. They were something else. A voice, faint and distant, whispered in my ear, "Join us." The words sent a chill through my soul, and for a moment, I was tempted. The train seemed to offer a strange kind of peace, an escape from the pain and regret that had haunted me since that fateful night in 1910. But something held me back. A memory, perhaps, or a spark of defiance. The whistle blew again, louder this time, and the train began to move. Its wheels churned through the snow, the carriages fading into the storm until only the faint glow of its lights remained. And then it was gone, leaving behind nothing but silence and the faint imprint of its tracks. I never spoke of that night, though I suspect others have seen the train as well. Over the years, there have been reports, faint whistles in the distance, ghostly lights on the tracks, and the chilling sound of wheels grinding against iron. The locals call it the Christmas train, a name that sounds almost cheerful until you hear the stories. They say it still rides the rails on snowy nights, searching for passengers to fill its empty seats. If you're ever near Sierra Hollow on Christmas Eve and you hear a whistle in the distance, be wary. The train is always looking for more souls to carry into the unknown. And it doesn't take no for an answer. Story number 6. The Wailing Train. The Siberian winter was a beast unlike anything else on Earth. By December, the vast expanse of white was relentless, an unending wilderness of snow and ice stretching far beyond the horizon. The cold wasn't just a sensation, it was a force, gnawing at the edges of your sanity with every breath. I had spent most of my life hearing tales of the winters here, but nothing could have prepared me for the events of Christmas Eve in 1935. My name is Ivan Petrov, and back then, I was a railway worker stationed in Novosibirsk. The Trans-Siberian Railway was our lifeline, a fragile thread connecting the remote reaches of Siberia to the rest of the world. That winter, the shipments were crucial: coal, food, and medical supplies needed to sustain the villages scattered across the tundra. The last shipment before Christmas was a freight train bound for Krasnoyarsk, loaded with goods that would bring some semblance of joy and warmth to the frozen wilderness. I was assigned as one of the conductors, tasked with ensuring the cargo reached its destination. At the time, I didn't think much of the journey. It was a routine trip, harsh, grueling, but nothing out of the ordinary, or so I thought. We left Novosibirsk in the late afternoon, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The train, a hulking beast of steel and iron, rumbled through the snow-covered landscape, its wheels grinding against the frozen tracks. The crew was small: myself, Alexei the engineer, Mikhail the fireman, and a few workers in the rear caboose. The freight cars were locked tight, their contents secured for the long journey ahead. The storm began just after dusk. At first, it was nothing more than a gentle flurry, snowflakes swirling lazily through the air, but within hours, it transformed into a howling tempest, the wind screaming like a banshee as it lashed against the train. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the temperature plummeted to bone-chilling depths. Inside the cab, our breath fogged the air, and the heat from the engine was barely enough to keep us warm. It was then that I heard the first sound, a faint, almost imperceptible wail, carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was the storm, a trick of the wind howling through the metal of the train. But as the night wore on, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a cry of anguish, raw and guttural, unlike anything I had ever heard. It came from the freight cars, echoing through the steel walls like the lament of lost souls. "What the hell is that?" Alexei muttered, his eyes darting toward the rear of the train. The man was no stranger to the harsh realities of Siberia, but I could see the unease in his expression. "Probably just the wind," Mikhail said, though his voice lacked conviction. But it wasn't just the wind. As the hours dragged on, the cries grew more frequent, joined by the unmistakable sound of scratching long, deliberate strokes against the metal doors of the freight cars. It was as if something or someone was trapped inside, desperately trying to get out. We stopped the train once to investigate, stepping out into the blinding storm with lanterns in hand. The snow was relentless, whipping against our faces as we struggled to the rear of the train. When we reached the first freight car, we hesitated. The wailing had stopped the moment we stepped outside. leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Alexei reached for the latch, his gloved hands trembling as he pulled the heavy door open. The interior was empty, save for crates of coal and sacks of grain. There was no sign of movement, no evidence of anything out of the ordinary, but the scratching was still there, faint and persistent, coming from the far end of the train. One by one, we opened the cars, each one revealing nothing but cargo. The sound seemed to shift, moving ahead of us, always just out of reach. When we reached the caboose, Alexei slammed the door shut and muttered, "It's the cold getting to us. We need to keep moving." We returned to the cab, our nerves frayed and our minds racing. But the storm only worsened, and the sounds became impossible to ignore. By midnight, it was no longer just wailing and scratching. There were voices, whispers that seemed to come from the very walls of the train. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their words guttural and alien, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, sorrow, despair. The temperature inside the train began to drop, frost creeping along the windows and metal fixtures. Even the engine seemed to struggle, its once steady rhythm faltering as if the train itself was succumbing to the cold. By dawn, we were lost. The storm had buried the tracks under feet of snow, and the landmarks we relied on had vanished into the blizzard. Alexei's hands were raw from gripping the controls, his eyes bloodshot and wild. Mikhail had stopped speaking altogether, staring blankly at the frost-covered window as if in a trance. As for me, I could barely think. The whispers had become a cacophony, drowning out even the roar of the engine. They spoke directly to my mind, filling it with images of death and desolation. And then the train stopped. The engine wheezed one final breath before falling silent, leaving us stranded in the middle of nowhere. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of footsteps crunching through the snow outside. I turned to Alexei, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you hear that?" He nodded, his face pale. "Someone's out there." We armed ourselves with whatever we could find, wrenches, crowbars, anything that might serve as a weapon, and stepped out into the blizzard. The snow was blinding, the cold so intense it felt like knives against my skin. But through the haze, I saw them, figures, dozens of them, moving through the storm. They were gaunt, their faces obscured by the swirling snow, but their eyes burned with an unnatural light. They surrounded the train, their mouths open in a silent scream, their hands clawing at the steel walls. We fled back inside, barricading the doors as the wailing reached a fever pitch. The temperature plummeted further, frost forming on our clothes and hair. I don't remember much of what happened next, only fragments of terror and cold. When I awoke, the storm had passed. The train was buried in snow, its interior frozen solid. Alexei and Mikhail were gone, their footprints leading away from the train and vanishing into the white void. I was alone, trapped in a tomb of ice and steel. They found me a week later, delirious and frostbitten, clutching a piece of coal as if it were a lifeline. I told them what had happened, but no one believed me. The official report blamed the storm, chalking up the deaths to hypothermia and poor judgment. But I know the truth. The train was cursed, a vessel for something ancient and malevolent. The whispers still haunt my dreams, their voices calling me back to the frozen wilderness. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howls like a dying beast, I hear the wailing again, echoing through the Siberian tundra. The train is still out there, buried in snow, waiting for its next passengers. And it's always hungry. Story number 7. The Phantom Train of London. The winter of 1890 in London was brutal. Snow blanketed the city, transforming the bustling streets into treacherous paths of ice and slush. Gas lamps flickered in the biting wind, casting long, wavering shadows on the cobblestone streets. Despite the weather, the promise of Christmas filled the air, with carolers singing outside shops and children eagerly peeking into frosted windows at toys they hoped to find under their trees. I was working as a clerk at the London and South Western Railway, stationed at Waterloo Station, one of the busiest hubs in the city. My life was ordinary, filled with the rhythmic monotony of ticket sales, passenger inquiries, and the occasional heated argument with a traveler who'd missed their train. That Christmas Eve, however, was anything but ordinary. It started with the fog, thick and unnatural. It rolled in from the Thames just as the sun dipped below the horizon, enveloping the station in an eerie gloom. The lamps barely pierced through it, their light casting a sickly, yellowish glow. The cold was relentless, seeping into my bones despite the layers of wool I wore. The few travelers who braved the weather looked more like ghosts than people, their breath visible in the frigid air as they shuffled toward their destinations. At 8 p.m., the train to Birmingham was scheduled to depart. I was standing at my booth, stamping tickets, when I noticed an unusual group of passengers boarding the train. They were well-dressed, their attire more suited to a grand ballroom than a railway carriage. There was something off about them. Their faces were pale, their eyes sunken and dark, and none of them spoke a word. They moved as if in a trance, their steps perfectly synchronized, and I felt an inexplicable chill as they passed. "Odd crowd tonight," muttered Henry, the conductor, as he joined me at the platform. He was a jovial man, his rosy cheeks and booming laugh a constant presence at the station. But tonight, he seemed uneasy. "Did you notice their tickets?" I nodded. "Old style. Haven't seen those in years." The tickets the passengers handed over were indeed peculiar. They were the outdated sort, phased out nearly 2 decades earlier, and each one bore a strange, ornate stamp, a design I didn't recognize. I should have questioned it, but something about the group made me reluctant to draw attention to them. At precisely 8:15 p.m., the train's whistle blew, and it pulled away from the platform, disappearing into the fog like a shadow swallowed by darkness. I watched it go, a nagging sense of unease settling in my chest. It was the last time anyone saw the train or its passengers. By morning, news of the missing train spread like wildfire. Railway officials were in a frenzy, scouring every inch of track between London and Birmingham. The snowstorm from the night before had subsided, leaving a pristine, undisturbed blanket of white across the countryside. There were no signs of derailment, no broken tracks, no evidence that the train had encountered any obstacles. It was as if it had simply vanished into thin air. The official explanation was mechanical failure. The higher-ups insisted the train had likely veered onto an old and used track and would be found soon enough. But those of us who worked at the station knew better. There was something unnatural about that night, something that defied logic and reason. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of the train. Search parties returned empty-handed, their faces pale and drawn. Whispers of the phantom train began to circulate among the railway workers, fueled by tales of ghostly sightings and strange occurrences along the tracks. Henry, who had been the last to inspect the train before its departure, became increasingly agitated. He spoke of hearing faint voices in the fog, of seeing shadowy figures along the tracks when no one was there. His jovial demeanor was replaced by a haunted, vacant look, and one day, he simply stopped coming to work. It was mid-January when the first real clue appeared. A track inspector named William stumbled upon a set of tracks deep in the countryside, hidden beneath a thicket of trees. The tracks were rusted and overgrown, long abandoned by the railway. At the end of the line, he found the train. It was derelict, its once pristine carriages now covered in frost and decay. The windows were shattered, the interior coated in a thick layer of ice. There was no sign of the passengers or crew. The only thing out of place was a single item left behind in one of the compartments. A ticket, identical to the ones the passengers had handed me that night. It bore the same ornate stamp, along with a chilling inscription. One way only. The discovery reignited the mystery, drawing investigators and journalists from across the country. But no amount of scrutiny could explain what had happened. The passengers were never found, and the train itself seemed to defy the passage of time. Metal that should have rusted through was intact. The ice inside the compartments never melted, and the air around it was unnaturally cold. I couldn't shake the feeling that the train was more than just a machine. It felt alive, as if it were watching us, waiting for something or someone. Against my better judgment, I returned to the site one evening, driven by a need to understand. The train loomed in the fading light, its presence oppressive and unnatural. As I stepped aboard, the temperature plummeted, my breath fogging the air. The interior was eerily intact, the furnishings untouched by decay despite the frost that coated every surface. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, growing louder as I ventured deeper into the carriage. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was a cacophony of sound, a symphony of despair. "They're still here," it said, "trapped between worlds." A figure appeared at the end of the corridor, shrouded in shadow. It was one of the passengers, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She raised a hand, pointing toward the window. I turned to look and saw my own reflection staring back at me. But it wasn't me. The figure in the glass was older, weathered, and wearing the same ornate stamp as the ticket. I fled, stumbling out of the train and into the night. The whispers followed me, fading only when I reached the safety of the main road. I never returned to the site, but the nightmares never left me. The faces of the passengers, their hollow eyes and lifeless smiles, haunt my dreams to this day. The train was eventually dismantled, its parts scattered across the country. But strange reports continued to emerge, phantom whistles in the night, shadowy figures seen along the tracks, and whispers in the fog. Some say the train still rides the rails on Christmas Eve, searching for passengers to join its ghostly journey. If you ever hear a whistle in the distance on a foggy winter night, remember this story. The phantom train of London still rides, carrying its passengers into the unknown. And it's always looking for one more ticket.